Well, welcome everyone. This is our second installment of the New York City HealthTech Summit. We're very pleased to have you all attend and be a part of the conversation. The reason we host these events is to elevate the discourse around revenue cycle, given how important of a topic revenue cycle is to the fabric of American society. If you think about the percentage of GDP that is allocated towards healthcare and the dollar amount of payments that are flowing through this oftentimes antiquated system, we think it's really important to elevate the discourse around revenue cycle, introduce new and innovative ideas from folks that are, multidisciplinary and working within revenue cycle on a daily basis. So, thank you for joining, and we're looking forward to an interactive conversation. We'll have some time for a QA at the end of our panel here, which I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for joining, who I'll introduce here in a moment. I had a very full circle moment recently. I was flying back from Europe to New York, and we're somewhere over the Atlantic, and captain comes up on PA and he says, code red, which is never a good thing. We're having a medical emergency. If there's a doctor or a nurse or a paramedic on board, preferably in network with Cigna, please come to the galley. I'm just joking. Turns out the guy was going into cardiac arrest, and the provider couldn't provide treatment because there's no prior authorization fulfilled prior to that. So now that I've gotten you all warmed up, I'm going to introduce our panelists. It's a very multidisciplinary group, and we're very excited to talk about the threading of the needle, we call it, across legal, finance, and revenue cycle, which ultimately then extends into our banking partners as an industry, and the kind of underlying revenue cycle performance that is oftentimes hard to interpret, or oftentimes a direct feedback loop into each of these organizations' jobs to be done. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Shilpa Patel, who is the Chief Legal and Business Officer of Kindbody, a digital health organization based here in New York City. I'd like to introduce Marji Karlin, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at New York City Health and Hospitals, a very large health system based here in New York City. I'd also like to introduce Jay, who is the CFO of Spectrum Vision Partners, a large vision group based here in the Northeast. And last but not least, I'd love to introduce our esteemed partner from J.P. Morgan, who represents the mid-market commercial banking practice at J.P. Morgan Healthcare. So excited to have a conversation primarily around the very cross-functional and, I would say, dispersed importance of revenue cycle and revenue cycle performance to each of the functions that are represented here on the stage. Maybe starting off with Marji, given your role as CRO at New York City Health and Hospitals, I'd love to understand, on a weekly basis or a quarterly basis, how are you interfacing with your counterparts in legal, in finance, and potentially even outside of the walled garden of New York City Health and Hospitals? Are you interfacing with counterparts perhaps in the commercial banking side as well?
So the interaction is actually pretty much on a daily basis. We are in constant communication with our legal team. Our compliance team is something that we've talked about, and maybe not daily, but pretty frequently with our colleagues at our bank in the banking industry as well, to the extent that they support the revenue cycle process. So we talk to the legal team, either contracting with vendors, and that's huge for us. We have a lot of vendor relationships, either outsourcing or technology vendors that we work with. We have our different legal teams working with our managed care contracts and helping us understand what's in them, because sometimes they're pretty complicated, and helping us escalate issues to the payers when we're not getting relief on the payers. And on the banking side, really just helping us streamline the revenue cycle processes. The banks have, great technology that can help us streamline the payment applications, payment processing, and all that. So we really, it's a partnership, and it's, an everyday thing for us.
Great, thank you. One of the things that I'm constantly reminded of is the fact that revenue cycle is a very dense subject matter. It almost feels like a different language. You have all these acronyms, all these codes, all these nuances across the different payers you might be in network with, the different geographies you may be performing services within. And the bedrock of all of the services we provide as provider groups is actually the contract. A contract is fundamentally like a legal doctrine, right? And so, having to translate what is a very dense subject matter into terms that legal teams are able to understand and navigate through and maintain the integrity of, as well as finance teams, is a topic that I'd love to chat with Shilpa and Jay about a little bit to understand how, where do you see gaps today around being able to translate what the kind of dictionary of RCM actually means, how that translates back to the contracts that you're engaged in with the different payers that you're in network with, and how you liaise with RCM and your counterparts in revenue cycle today.
Nice to see all of you, for the few of you that I can see in the sunlight right now. So we are a fertility and family building company. We have 34 clinics across the country. We opened our first clinic in 2019, so we're a relatively new company. And from that perspective, I'll speak to payer contracting and our RCM department. It's a bit different. I don't know how many of you in the audience are sort of at startup to emerging growth stage companies, but in the early days of payer contracting was get a contract. We need to be in network. We want to start seeing patients. Get a contract and take the rates. And in the fertility and family building side, it's a kind of small set of CPT and ICD-10 codes. And since then, which has only been five years, we've really concentrated on negotiating those rates. But part of that negotiation of rates is really, there's a strategy behind it. It's working with the finance team. It's working with the RCM team to really understand which rates do we want to focus on, which are the rates that are the highest revenue generating procedures, treatments that we do, and educating the payer contracting team to focus on those rates and what a negotiation from a legal perspective, what a negotiation strategy is. Sort of pretend like you're giving them a win on some of the rates that you really don't care about, and make sure that you're focused on the rates that you really care about and you get those up. And then the other part of it is the fee schedules. The payers don't want to give you get the contract, but you don't get the fee schedule. And then you spend a significant amount of time trying to get the fee schedule. You get kind of thrown around the entire payer organization, and you finally get it. And I think that you guys can probably speak to this better than me, but making sure that on the RCM side, and this is something we've had to make sure that our RCM team is doing, is that they have the right fee schedules and the right charge masters, and so that we know what we're billing, basically. I think that's core too.
Right. And it's fascinating that, Shilpa, as a chief legal officer, you're having to kind of demystify and interpret the T's and C's on the various different contracts you have in place and interpret them in a way that allows you to wage a more effective and more empirical kind of negotiation with payers in a way that, to your point, allows you to concede on certain rates and actually hold the payer's feet to the fire on other rates. And part of the way that, we think we can begin to liberate or inform those conversations is by benchmarking a particular payer's performance relative to the contracts they have in place, relative to other payers in a particular geography, and holding the payer's feet to the fire to the extent that we can on, hey, here's the quantum of claims that you've underpaid me over the last 12 months. They were very small dollar amount underpayments, but across the 50,000 claims that were underpaid by $5, it's a material amount, and therefore we want to advocate for a rate increase. Or, hey, you downcoded X number of claims kind of erroneously relative to other payers that are accepting these claims with the same level of documentation. And so having this very empirical and benchmark discussion is something that we think has been missing. If you think about any negotiation in your lives, whether it's negotiating for a home or negotiating for a loan, you're going to have comps. You're going to have benchmarks to hold the counterparty's feet to the fire and be able to bring them to the table. Whereas in contracting for these negotiated rates, historically we haven't had access to that data, and so ultimately that's very much a function of kind of what a finance and FP&A team is likely looking at as they're modeling out inorganic and organic growth levers. And so, Jay, I'd love to understand how you've leveraged the revenue cycle reality of your particular provider group to do a better job of projecting working capital, do a better job of managing risk from a finance standpoint, and also do the work you need to do to chart out a growth plan for Spectrum Vision.
Thanks. First of all, like, I'm just wondering whether you guys were lurking in our board calls, and because like the topics that you just mentioned is like real live situations for me. But from my perspective, and I'm the CFO, I run finance, I run FP&A, and RCM reports to me as well. So when you ask the question, how do they interact? Well, do I talk to myself? Like it's part of integral, and that's the goal, right? We want finance and RCM to be integrated very tightly. So one of the things that we're hyper focused on is, to Shilpa's point, are we getting paid correctly, right? So the fee schedule, live view, like transaction level, visibility of what the allowables are for every procedure or every code that we submit. We want to see that, and then we want to make sure that when we track our actual cash collections against it, that we are actually on the way. And if we see some gap, then we raise the issue and go talk to the payers, saying, "Look, this is an issue. You guys are not paying us right because this is a published rates, et cetera." So that's one of the core things that we want to make sure we want to get right. As far as from a budgeting standpoint, like we run a bottoms-up budget based on the collection history, and then and because our organization, we're an ophthalmology practice group, but we've been growing by acquisition, so we come across different markets, different payer groups, under the same Aetna or whatever, but different markets. So we try to do a tactical analysis of what the reimbursement pros and cons is of the acquired target that we're acquiring, and see whether they have a more advantageous contract. They seldom do, but if they do, how do we preserve that from an organization standpoint? Do we keep that entity as a TIN separate, and we manage multiple contracts with multiple touch points with the payers, et cetera? So that's some of the things that we grapple with from a budgeting standpoint.
Thank you, Jay. And Jay's being extremely humble in kind of articulating how complicated of a job it is to actually ensure the payer is behaving with integrity and ensure that we're collecting against the fee schedules that we have in place. Every single payer will have a different format for how they share fee schedules. Cigna will look like X, Aetna will look like Y. There's not a very straightforward, up until very recently, way to actually ingest all this, the data and the ones and zeros of our contracts, normalize them, and then allow technology to do the work that it was designed to do, which is detect things that as revenue cycle leaders, as financial leaders, as legal leaders, we want technology to help us pinpoint. Kind of like how an American Express might identify potential fraudulent activity on your credit card. You rely on Amex to give you that consumer protection because it's kind of built algorithms based off of your spending habits and realizes, hey, you didn't buy a flight to the Philippines, but you just bought Nikes in the Philippines. Maybe there's a fraudulent transaction. There's no mechanism, at least up until recently, within revenue cycle that's actually monitoring what's taking place and detecting anomalies, which in our view is a really great application of AI, but it's also a really great application of potentially how we underwrite risk. And so, if you're extending a loan or you're buying a home or whatever it is, understanding risk is a really important driver of how credit is extended, and it's likely a topic that impacts your work at JPM. And so I'd love to understand your experience as you're evaluating the creditworthiness of some of your clients and formulating certain products. What sort of gaps or what sort of work do you do to kind of analyze the revenue cycle success of a particular group to underwrite them?
Okay. Okay, perfect. And thank you again for having JP Morgan here. It's a great question. And I would say increasingly over the last several years, and obviously, this year in particular, as we've seen both broad-based and isolated, issues, rev cycle issues really impact, healthcare companies across the board, from really small physician-owned practices, through really large, national scaled businesses. So it is a definite factor that we think about and factor into our lending decisions or credit decisions as we're underwriting businesses. And I would say similarly, as we work with potential buyers of these businesses in healthcare from a financial sponsor, growth equity, or even from a VC investor standpoint, that they are increasingly focused on. And so a lot of the diligence processes are taking a lot longer. They are hiring a lot of third-party consultants. We work in tandem with, third-party consultants to understand, does the business really have the infrastructure and, the decision support and checks and balances in place to ensure that, the rev cycle apparatus broadly defined is, well orchestrated as possible. And so, yes, as a lender, we're certainly digging in. And again, as we advise both investors and buyers, we're doing the same.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight the gravity of what was just discussed. Basically, the revenue cycle health of an organization will then play a very large role into determining the creditworthiness as well as the amount of credit, the rate at which that credit is issued, which then goes into financing how American healthcare is brought to consumers, right? So the reason we're excited about having this conversation is because it's very consequential to our daily lives and the lives of our fellow citizens. And I want to maybe pivot and to actually talk about the role technology can play, specifically AI can play in taking revenue cycle from where it is today and kind of the different downstream consumers of revenue cycle, how we can begin to elevate and go from landline to 5G, I like to say. Not to say that we're still stuck in landline, but go from this crawl to the run and actually adopt some of the more cutting edge technology that's available. I think it's ironic that AI has been used in healthcare for the last 10 to 15 years. I think in the imaging space, in the diagnostic space, almost every hospital system has some sort of application of AI and has had that application of AI in place for about a decade. But when you think about the back office of healthcare, where you think AI would be applied first, it's less consequential, right? You're not actually diagnosing someone using new technology. You're actually just processing claims or processing, forecasts, et cetera. We haven't seen quite a robust of an application up until recently. And so maybe Jay, I could invite you to chat a little bit more about why you think that's been the case and what gives you optimism for the future, especially as you kind of navigate the landscape of the new technologies that are available today.
Well, why is it like this, the hodgepodge of various things that are not completely integrated? I think we all know, right? It's like the history of our healthcare system and the way that the doctor, the practice group, at least from my perspective, not large health, hospital systems, but practice groups, it's used to be Main Street doctors like doing their thing, and then they would send off their charges to a billing company, and that's why there is no real integration from a technology standpoint at that level. And then we grew coalescing those, and then integration was the first and foremost thing that we want to solve. But once we do that, we want to layer in all these new technologies. So our organization views RCM not as a finance function or a revenue function. It's an entire organizational function, because the success in RCM needs to happen from the front desk for the clinic, right? And all the way through the billing. Because if they don't do the eligibility checks and, make sure that the patient's information are correctly and all the pre-authorizations are done in advance, then the problem kind of snowballs and it becomes a denial issue, and then we have to go chase it for multiple appeal cycles, et cetera. So we want to solve that. That's the problem that we want to solve holistically as we acquire different, tax ID number entities in different states, et cetera. So the technology that we are excited about is it touches every point there. So AI-driven eligibility checks, so that, we don't have to train every single, we have 1,000 people, right? In the clinics, right? Do I have to rely on every individual people's technology prowess to be able to solve that, right? Use technology to be able to make sure that whatever the little car that our 70-year-old cataract patient brings in, we can seamlessly integrate that into some sort of correct eligibility, and making sure that the correct messaging is done and correct documentation is done from step zero. And then it's doctors, right? Doctors will have, I've been doing, cataract surgery for 40 years. This is the way I do it. It's always worked. But how can we layer in seamless technology that's not disruptive to a very senior, very, good doctor who's 60 years old without telling him you got to relearn everything that you used to do, but at the same time be able to make sure that his documentation is top notch and doesn't trip up any of the payers' little traps that they set up just to create any kind of excuse for to flag a denial. So that's step 3. And then finally, just making sure the charge posting, we can do that as quickly as possible. Right now we have a rules-based charge posting mechanism set up, but how can we advance that to incorporate AI so that it's way more intelligent, so that it navigates both compliance, so that we don't do any kind of compliance issues on the charge posting, while at the same time optimizing the revenue that we can generate. So the whole chain.
So I would just challenge a little bit that the clinical AI is coming before the administrative or revenue cycle AI. We have a little bit of a different twist on that, which is we're not going to hurt anybody by experimenting with new technology and AI in a way that, clinically it's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. And so Health and Hospitals, for a variety of reasons, has taken the stance that we can experiment a little bit in revenue cycle, and we have been, and we are going to continue to. So we've had some automations in place. We're experimenting with AI for all the things that you're talking about, for charge capture, for coding. We have some AI capabilities already in those areas. We're looking at large language models to do, I'm going to say denial prevention. We are not yet looking at those same models to do appeal writing, as much as that's a necessity. I'm always just trying so hard to focus on preventing the denials rather than appealing them. I want them to go away. They won't go away, but I want them to go
I
away.
violently agree on that one.
Yeah. So, we've had all kinds of automations in at the front end. We've had all kinds of automations in the middle ground with, a very large health system is different than a bunch of acquired practices, or, a practice system, or, as you said, limited CPTs and ICD-10s. We run the gamut. Other administrative applications that will really support revenue cycle is, some of these contracts that you were talking about in a health system like ours are on 20-year-old paper, and they're just amendments and amendments, and the spreadsheets with the rates, because we do everything across 11 hospitals and nursing homes and all that. The spreadsheets are books and books and books of spreadsheets, and so to incorporate that into our patient accounting system to get those allowed amounts into it's to get it right all the time, it's just rough. So AI, I expect, could support that. I can't tell you how, but that's something that as a system we're looking at. We're not there yet, but we have been given the freedom to experiment on the revenue cycle side, because the worst that happens is that we spend a little money and don't make back as much as we thought. Chances are we'll make something back, but maybe not as much as we thought.
And I was just going to add on to what Jay was saying about it being a whole organization endeavor, RCM, and that similar, I think one of the challenges is that with physician practices, typically they haven't had until this is an argument for PE and VC investments in healthcare, but until there was, and when they operated as solo practices, mom and pop practices, they didn't have the capital to invest in technology and to utilize these different programs and automation. And now that they do have that capital, it's really, I think that's one of the core benefits of PE and VC and other investments in healthcare is making that difference. One of the things that there's a challenge, I think, to automation, and I'm curious your thoughts, is a challenge for us is that we have a little bit of a complicated system. We have patients who we manage the fertility benefit for employers. So that's a totally different revenue stream and operations. We are in network with the major commercial payers. That's your traditional RCM structure. And then we have a significant amount of self-pay patients. But even that self-pay patient, I would say that over at least the past 10, 15 years with the prevalence of high deductible health plans and more people having larger out-of-pocket costs, it's the consumer or the patient that really doesn't understand what they owe, and it's on that front end, which you were talking about, of educating them about what it is that they will owe out of pocket. It takes quite a bit. It takes a lot of human effort and navigation on that. So if we can get some automation there, I think it would be super helpful.
Absolutely. And I think it's a pretty timely comment to talk about the consumer's responsibility into their own healthcare and how that's kind of grown over the last 2 decades, where the high deductible health plan has now moved a lot of the kind of responsibility or burden of financing your healthcare onto patients with less reliance on healthcare, which is, of course, allowed for greater access for insurance, but has also meant that there's more margin pressure for provider groups who are now having to collect from patients versus payers. And I think it's timely because we're coming up against the renewal of the plan year at the end of the year, which means deductibles are going to reset, and kind of this pressure kind of kicks off again, or at least is heightened once again. I want to maybe wrap up because Dan's giving me a time check here with a final question on I think something that threads the needle across a couple of the topics that were mentioned. Jay, you discussed integration as being a big part of how your group drives value across these different groups that you're acquiring and kind of consolidating into a unified tech stack. Marji, you discussed kind of the cost of a false positive or a false negative in the back office of healthcare is a lot lower than a false negative or a false positive in the clinical space. And I think all of that kind of ties into this idea that the appetite around taking on risk and adopting new technology within healthcare, from our perspective, has completely changed. I think every healthcare organization is now looking for new and innovative ways to disrupt the way they think about operationalizing their organization. And Marty, maybe we could start with you. How over the last couple of years has the tenor within both you and your contemporaries changed as it relates to wanting to take a bet on a new piece of technology or being open to hearing about a new and innovative kind of way of doing something that historically was maybe not such a compelling kind of pool of risk that you'd want to bite into?
So I don't think it's changed extraordinarily. I mean, I've been lucky. I've been in health and hospitals for 6 years, and we have, in my tenure there, there's been an appetite for doing things better, doing things more efficiently, using technology. I will say my first year and a half there, we were implementing Epic. And so Epic is it was the first unifying system-wide EMR. Each of the hospitals had their own EMR prior to that. So that was huge for us. And that in of itself was really eye-opening for the system. It was a single data platform that everybody had eyes on. And it was the first time, which was transformational for the system. And we then spent the next couple of years in the throes of COVID optimizing Epic. And so, we have this Epic first mentality, see if we could do it within the system we own and paid millions of dollars for. And then if not, where there is an appetite to look outside, there's an appetite to incorporate technology. I would say right now, really the only barrier to that is just how fast we can do it. We become a funnel, whether it's through security, legal, and what data security is what I'm talking about. Our legal team, our procurement team, and it's not their fault. Nobody's trying to be a barrier, but there's a lot coming at them from all parts of the hospital, and we're just vying for attention and vying for resources.
Great. I think one thing I'd like to bring up is I get a lot of questions from investors around the company, prospects, even my close friends. They're like, why hasn't healthcare figured this out yet? And I think it's only been 10 to 15 years of time under tension for technologists to actually begin to consume a digitized health record. I think it wasn't until kind of the 2010s where we found a critical mass of adoption into an electronic health record. And Marji, you could probably correct me if you disagree, but technologists simply haven't had enough reps and time under tension to actually crack the code on meaningful and long-term and systemic change that can drive long-term value. And I think to wrap things up, Lauren, I'd love to hear, and Shilpa had discussed VC-backed groups, private equity-backed groups have the ability to invest in technology. I'm curious, from your perspective, as a banking partner to many of these groups, how do you think about evaluating investments in technology versus evaluating more capital, capital investments or acquisitive investments, and how does that excite you or change the calculus of the work that you do?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question and very topical because, the mentality of growth, broadly speaking, has changed over the past year and a half, which is growth at all costs is out, growth at a reasonable pace and a sustainable pace is in. And I think in healthcare specifically, that means, having your house in order, so to speak, and having the right infrastructure around all things rev cycle, being forward thinking in terms of reducing the friction, right? Minimizing the patient payments that are made, physically or with checks or in office. And so, from our perspective and when we're working alongside our investor clients, it is something we definitely are looking at in terms of how forward thinking as a company in getting this, infrastructure right and making these investments and setting some level of accountability to the investments, right? I think everyone's a little bit more capital sensitive these days. And so being really thoughtful around which, health tech providers you're working with and third-party, providers you're working with, and making sure that there are tangible results or benefits and efficiencies and cost savings and things. So, I would say it's certainly something that is on the rise. And I think as an investor, as a lender, we'd much rather see a business invest in getting that right versus growing at all costs and going out and being a serial acquirer. I think also, interestingly enough, at a lot of VCs and financial sponsors, they have a revenue cycle expert at this point. So they have teams that are focused on supporting their portfolio companies, in a unified way across their portfolios.
Yeah, great insight. And I think certainly over the last 5 years, there's been a shift away from growth at all costs and more of this operational excellence and maintaining good sustainable metrics across not only venture-backed businesses, but also private equity-backed businesses. And I'll keep in mind the comment you brought up around being open and investing in technology the next time we're negotiating a contract with a private equity-backed group. When Akash first told me that we'd be having a banker, a lawyer, and a finance guy be a part of this panel, I thought it was the beginning of a bad joke. But I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you guys found it insightful. I think what gives me a lot of excitement and optimism is that there's never been more attention and focus on what you just mentioned, Lauren, operational excellence. And we think that solving for some of the very low-hanging and obvious fruit within revenue cycle is the first kind of foray into unlocking some of that operational excellence. And there's a whole world of, I think, benefit that initially will behoove the outcomes of provider groups, but over time will bend towards the patient, which is ultimately our goal, is to help American citizens and folks enjoy a lower cost of care. So thank you for your time and attention and consideration. I think we have time for a brief Q&A.
Aman mentioned there's been a vast expansion of use of technology in the since the ACA and the incentives that were put into that towards technology, and went from almost maybe a dearth of options to, I'm certain you all get 400 emails and phone calls and sales pitches every day, every week, every hour. How do you sift through all of that? Every company has AI, every company has ML, every company's going to change your world. And how do you sift through the ones that are meaningful? How do you, what do you look for, and how do you identify the ones you want to have conversations with?
So we do get any number of outreaches every single day. And you just have to have a strategy before and not get distracted by it, because I can spend all day, pretty much every day, on the phone with vendors or in meetings trying to evaluate their technology and the newest, greatest thing that I didn't know I needed. So we have a strategy. We know for each of our revenue cycle disciplines, the front end, the middle, the back, HIM especially, what it is we want to accomplish. We do a scan of the market. We use services like Class and others to understand. We go meet people at conferences for sure. And then being a city agency, we have a very disciplined procurement process. We issue RFPs and we, get buy-in from our legal and IT partners, our other finance partners, and we go about our business that way. But it has to be planfully and thoughtfully, and it really can be a huge distraction if we didn't do it otherwise.
If I had the perfect answer to your question, like it'll be like, I'll be playing golf every Friday, right? It's the hardest part. And I consider it similar to like making a hiring decision for a fairly meaningful role in the organization. Like, how do I know that, I'll get, 100 candidates? And it's very similar to that. And especially when it's a new concept or new technology that we don't have prior experience on. So I think it was well said, but like the RFP or requirements definition is like the most important thing, right? So we need to know exactly what we're wanting or what we feel we're deficient on, and then we engage with all the vendors, all 80,000 of them, and kind of select them and see how well they respond, and then we go through similar to like a hiring decision. We do the reference checks, right? And then we test them out, and if we can do a pilot without too much exposure from a commitment standpoint, we'll do that. We have our footprint allows us to do that, and then we make the decision.
Great panel, by the way. Marji, quick question for you. I heard you say earlier about the thousands and hundreds of thousands of documents that are going through and the amount of information that's being processed. At what point do you look at this and say, okay, this is enough, now we got to go digital transformation?
Unfortunately, it's not my call. But I think that the organization, remember, we're a very old organization, and, I don't want to say new to technology, that's unfair, but it was a lot of these things over many, many years was decentralized among the hospitals. And there's just a coordination in the last, I'm going to say 6 years only, I can't take credit for it. But our CEO has really brought the system together in a system-like way. So, we in healthcare, we overuse this a lot, but systemness is really important to this. So now maybe we have the opportunity to do that. And I think, there's all kinds of things. There's policies and procedures and bylaws and things that are all on paper, and some of the newer contracts are digitized, but some of these old contracts, they have to be digitized in a way that they can be read. And so there's talk about, starting with new paper on some of these contracts, but that is for some of these payer contracts. And, I'll say it now. And I had thought to say it earlier, but we don't have payers here, at least on the panel, which is really a missing link to all this. But that could be a multi-year project to really just redo one contract from the beginning. That's how big these hospital health system contracts are. So yes, but I don't get to make that choice.
Wrap things up with Austin.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Sorry, Jay, I'm one of the 80,000 vendors. Just a quick question. We're focused on revenue tonight. We've talked a lot about what we can do to make sure that we're getting paid for what we bill at the end. I'm curious what's top of mind for opportunities further upstream. So even going to the point of a patient visit, what are things all of you are thinking of to make sure that you're getting everything documented, that you're then coding it correctly? Because it's one problem to capture everything that you billed for, but what are ways that you can make sure you're billing for and accurately representing everything that your clinicians ultimately should be getting compensated for? Just any sort of top of mind ideas there, whether technology is part of it or not.
I think first and foremost is like, capture the relevant information from the patient at the earliest possible juncture. And that means if I can avoid having that person sit in front of the front desk counter and, you know, whether through an iPad or the work kiosk or through a, God forbid, a clipboard with a form, right? I want to do that well in advance. So, you know, we institute various technologies, right? We have a call center that takes inbound client scheduling bookings, right? So can we capture that there, right? Or for the typical demographic of the grandson making the reservation for their grandma's cataract surgery, they'll go online, right? So we have, does our online capability have sufficient information without taxing them too much? If I start asking them, well, what are your symptoms, and like making it into a like 10-step process, then we lose the booking. So how do we capture that as much upfront so that we have the information accuracy, we can front run the checking and the processing of it. And then when they finally show up, if there's a few missing points, then that's all that we take, makes a whole flow better, right? That's the holy grail. You know, we have a number of tools deployed already. I will be fully transparent. I'm not happy with the current state of that. It could be more, and that'll be one of the things that we touch. And that all, again, goes to the whole point of RCM. It's a full value chain cycle starting from the Facebook ad that we put up, right, for our LASIK surgery.
And I think also the EHR, I mean, I think making it easy for the doctors to easily code, and educating them and re-educating them and auditing them and then educating them again. And it's like, it's a seriously arduous process, but we've developed our own electronic medical record system in-house, and a core function of the EHR is to make it easier for the doctors to code so that we can bill appropriately.
And I would add to that, the use of structured templates is critical. And if you use the structured template correctly, the charges automatically drop, which is a beautiful thing. But we know that our providers don't always use the appropriate structured template. And so not the wrong charges drop, but not all of the charges drop. So we are dabbling right now in using AI to read the record and compare it to what was billed and say, okay, well, you know, you billed an office visit here, but you did an endoscopy too. So wouldn't that be the thing you want to bill? And so we have a workflow engine behind the AI to, for a coder then to review it. And we're, you know, hopefully we'll get to the point that they won't all have to be manually reviewed, and that, yes, we're going to then use that as a tool to educate our providers to document it in the right way so that we don't have to do this. But we are looking to take those kinds of findings and automatically charge based on that if we can validate the charge. So just one example. I mean, I agree with everything else that's been said for sure. We have all the front end stuff for the patient information, but from our biggest hurdle is clinical documentation.
If there are no other questions, we will wrap this panel. Thank you so much to our panelists. A round of applause, please.
Thank you, guys.
Amazing.
Thank you, Marji.